have a fiscal impact for what it might cost the Secretary of State?
When we have a piece of legislation, we will be able to ask for a fiscal note. Without having an actual piece of legislation, I cannot ask for a fiscal note, but we will be filing for a fiscal note to see what that is. There's also in the provision of the bill the fees as you have right now when you go to get your fingerprints and get your license, that those fees would be able to be collected by the state to offset those costs.
Is it possible they go up for gun ownership? I'm sorry, last question on this. Is it possible that gun owners might have to pay more in these fees to offset the Secretary of State?
Again, like I said, I have going to take the opportunity to sit down with the new Secretary of State to make sure that he has his input into this. And we've also, like I said, we've put out the effective date to January 1st, 2012 to allow for all of this information and be able to make sure that we have a seamless. Yes, Walter?
Would the fiscal note include having metal detectors in the doors to all these different agencies, say even in the Capitol? I mean, instead of just going through the front door, now you got to have one at the Secretary of State's office because somebody might have made it legally one way but can't further go that way.
Absolutely.
Mitch, on the House version of this bill, I think they addressed the airport issue by saying that folks with a license can carry, I think, all the way up to the metal detectors administered by TSA. Does your bill speak to that particular issue?
It does not directly speak to that, but it would allow to carry in the unsecured areas of an airport. But I would be to tell you what's interesting is the federal law has taken place from the metal detectors in the secured area, and have made absolutely no statement or regulation for unsecured areas in airports. More than 40 states allow lawful carry to occur in non-secured area of an airport. So in this legislation, when we say you can carry, it would allow that part of the airport.
Lots of folks who I've talked to, legislative leaders, have been talking about the fact that this is a year that everything's going to be focused on the budget, so that it's going to be difficult to focus on other things. Whenever we ask them about, gun legislation or wanting to, sort of clarify carry laws, well, this is the year in which we're talking about the budget, and I don't know, that's going to be the focus. I mean, are you going to struggle to get attention for this year, given the fact that the budget seems to be sucking all the oxygen from the room?
Well, I have spent more than 100 hours working on the budget, and I have gone through about 1,700 activities of our state in dealing with the budget. And I don't think I've had a single person in here come ask me a question about the budget, and that's where my time is. So I think when it comes to the attention to this issue, I think y'all are making it a whole lot more of a hot item than it is in my place. But as a legislator, I've heard from my constituents, this is an issue that needs to be clarified. Like I said, we have a gotcha law that I honestly feel like that it needs to be clarified. And so that's why I filed this legislation. We had a study committee. I got a lot of input. And as I said in my remarks, I don't believe in wasting the people's time or money.
Just as a general idea, is it a good idea to bring a concealed gun into a bar?
I'll let the property owner make that decision. They make the decision right now whether or not to serve people or not to serve people by alcohol. And I think there's been many more unintended consequences from the use of alcohol than there has been in firearms.
Either one of you, Mr. Rogers, you can feel free to weigh on this. What's the likelihood that this bill will come up for a floor vote?
Well, first let me state, had I known we were going to talk about a gun bill today, I would have worn a different color tie. I had the opportunity to serve on this committee with Senator Seabaugh, and he did an outstanding job. Anybody that participated in it knows that it was a very thorough look at where we are with our gun laws today. So I hope that every piece of legislation gets the same consideration. If it's a good piece of legislation, it ought to move forward. If it's not, it shouldn't. But I think one thing that's missing here when we talk about this is that nothing in this bill is new ground that some other state doesn't already have today. And that's extremely important because sometimes when we talk about guns or gun violence or what may happen, we're presuming or we're suggesting or we're contemplating the unknown. Well, in this case, we know that this is not unknown because every facet of this bill is already law in some other state. So when we suggest, do we need metal detectors at every government building? Well, other states have this same law in place, and they don't use metal detectors at every building, and there aren't shootouts, and there aren't people being gunned down. So this is not necessarily new ground. In fact, Georgia, as it pertains to people who have a license to carry, may be the most restrictive state in America. Yet we see in those areas where they're not so restrictive that there has been no problem with these very safe people who have gone through the background checks having a license to exercise their Second Amendment rights. So again, I know that when we hear the word guns, we we conjure up all these images, but I would just suggest, as Senator Seabaugh said, that you look at the different facets of this bill, you go look at some of the other states that already have this in place, and you can look at the data yourself and see if there's been any violent act associated with those people having licenses, and I would suggest there has not.
So Senator Rogers, you see this as a easing of restrictions in Georgia. This helps bring Georgia out of that most restrictive ground compared to the rest of the country.
Well, I think, again, you know, if you understand the right and the reason, which I'm sure you do, to have that our founders created the Second Amendment, and that government may have overstepped their bounds in many areas of restricting those rights and reasons, and we've now established a process by which someone can prove that they're a law-abiding citizen. We're going to check your background and make sure you haven't done anything wrong. Then I think once they've gone to that step, certainly we ought to lift as many restrictions as possible on their constitutional rights, and this is really what this is doing.
So you see it as an expansion of where you can carry guns?
Well, I don't necessarily see it as an expansion. I mean, the right exists today, and the government has put some restrictions in place on getting that license. And so we're going to take a look at that, and this bill certainly contemplates that. And where someone has, again, proven that they are not a danger, the government ought to be restricting their rights. So I think, you know, in current law, we are restricting rights beyond what they ought to be. But again, some of the other work that's done here that I think, you know, as we went through this process, again, commending Senator Seabaugh, one of the things that everybody in the room seemed to agree on is that list of prohibitions against people who can receive a license really needs to be updated. You have some prohibitions on there that shouldn't be on there. You have prohibitions that are not on there that ought to be on there. And he's addressed some of those here, and that's extremely important. And to Tom's question earlier about, you know, restoring rights, I mean, we heard testimony, or no, I had lunch with a gentleman, and I don't think he'd mind me reporting this, but he, as a college student, his father was a doctor and gave him some prescription drugs that didn't have his name on it. And as a college student, he got busted with it in his room. Some 30 years later, this same person has a vending business where he sells all sorts of items for concerts and things like T-shirts. So he has lots of cash on him. Yet he cannot get a firearm license because something happened 30 years prior over some prescription drugs his father gave, and those things need to be addressed.
But on the issue of whether it will come to the floor, I mean, the last 2 years, I mean, we've had some terrific fights over gun rights, and most of them have occurred in the Senate. And I know that the Senate caucus can be sometimes divided on this. I mean, is there an agreement within the caucus that this bill will go forward and it will get a vote on the floor?
Well, I think that, and I can't speak for Senator Seabaugh, there's no agreement that any piece of legislation is going to go forward, but the senator has gone from senator to senator to senator explaining what this bill does, and I think with any of us, if our caucus is not in favor of it, you probably won't see it. Only at the point in time which we get a majority of the people to say, yeah, this is the right public policy, will we move forward. So, you know, commending again Senator Seabaugh, this is not something he's attempting to force down anybody. This is not something we're putting out there to try to get a yay or nay gun vote on. This is something that we believe is good public policy, and if it makes sense to the members of the Senate, it'll go forward. If it doesn't make sense, it'll die.
Last question, please.
Using your same rationale that we have some of the tightest restrictions and our numbers are some of the lowest, problems are happening everywhere else, why would we want to release those? Why ease up?
I don't know about our numbers being the lowest, but
Well, you just said that the problems are elsewhere, not here.
I said there aren't any problems elsewhere. So the other states where where these restrictions that Georgia currently has do not exist, they do not have these hypothetical problems that people suggest may occur if we were to lift these restrictions.
I will say this, that there are some states that do not even require a license to carry a firearm, and they have much lower crime numbers than the state of Georgia does. So I would say that doesn't necessarily apply to that.
You believe that to be a causal effect?
Hang on, there's one thing I wanted to follow up on the process. Most of you know me very well, and I work very hard to do due diligence. I also know that I don't have all the answers, and that's why you have to have a piece of legislation to start from, and then we go through the committee process and we get all the input to see what we come up with a bill that makes sense, and that's what I'm trying to do. This is the starting process, and we will go through to see if we can make this common sense proposal into a common sense piece of legislation, and that is my intent. And there's no way that I would ask anybody to vote on something that didn't meet that criteria. Thank you very much.